Welcome back to Vet Connect. In this session, we're going to explore the subject of addictions. Addictions includes abuse of substances like alcohol and drugs. We'll look first at the roads into addiction, the ways veterans become users, abusers, and addicts. Then we'll explore the road to recovery, and finally map the road ahead from recovery to personal renewal and new life in community. Let's start by defining addiction.
The psychological aspects of addiction are many. The main one, I think, is compulsive use of a substance despite knowing that there are harms to your family, to your body, to your spirit.
Addiction is a brain disease, meaning that all of these mood-altering chemicals or substances that we put into our body have an effect on our brain.
Some people who struggle with addictions later in life had already started using in the early years.
It was when I was a student at the University of Tennessee, and I had to cut back the partying, the drinking, the pot use, all the other drug use, so I could keep enough grades to keep enough hours to keep my draft deferment. I couldn't do it. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't reel it back in enough to do what I needed to do to keep my draft deferment. Next thing I know, I'm being asked to join my fellow citizens in the U.S. Army.
Others begin to develop addictive habits during their military service.
Back in the mid-'70s, when I was in the military, that's where I learned to drink and use drugs.
One of the analogies that I frequently use is comparing it to physical therapy. A lot of times when we have an injury of some kind, especially a soft tissue type injury that requires a healing process to go on, part of that healing process is to break through the way that we've come to start to protect ourselves in a physical sense. And so physical therapy is not always a pleasant process because the therapist has to go in and knead muscles, stretch ligaments, to do things that are uncomfortable for us in order to promote healing.
Trust God to do what you can't. Pray without ceasing. But don't get drawn into someone else's problems so that it becomes your own. And if someone's recovery stalls, do what you can to help them get back on track. But be patient and forgiving of yourself and trust them to the mercies of the higher power above all others. Thank you for being part of this session, and thank you for your service. Welcome back to Vet Connect. In this session, we're going to explore the subject of addictions. Addictions includes abuse of substances like alcohol and drugs. Compulsive behaviors are dangerous to oneself or harmful to relationships, like street racing, gambling, or promiscuous sexual activity may also fall into the category of addictions. Addictions are a real and growing problem for the veteran community. A recent study by the National Institute on Drug Abuse found that 25% of veterans 18 to 25 years of age met the clinical standards for diagnosis of substance abuse disorder. That's more than twice the rate of chronic substance abuse in the general population and among veterans aged 26 to 54. Another study of active duty service members revealed that in the month before the study data was collected, 11% had misused prescription medication, and nearly half, 47%, have been on one or more drinking binges. Addictions are closely connected to untreated or self-treated PTSD in veterans and to homelessness and suicide as well. As you'll see in this session, many roads can lead to addiction. Most of those roads are dark and lonely. Roads to recovery are fewer. Fortunately, there are paths out of darkness. There are many veterans in recovery who understand the addiction process. These fellow veterans can help others change the direction of their own lives. We'll look first at the roads into addiction, the ways veterans become users, abusers, and addicts. Then we'll explore the road to recovery and finally map the road ahead from recovery to personal renewal and new life in community. Let's start by defining addiction.
The psychological aspects of addiction are many. The main one, I think, is compulsive use of a substance despite knowing that there are harms to your family, to your body, to your spirit, and that the damage that it's wreaked you tend to, suppress or deny away and keep doing it despite the obvious consequences.
Addiction is a brain disease, meaning that all of these mood-altering chemicals or substances that we put into our body have an effect on our brain. That's the part of our body that controls our thoughts, our feelings, our actions, so that the chemicals that people are using begin to, they impact brain function. They impact the neurochemicals that transmit messages throughout the brain, and then those messages are transported to other parts of the body and tell us how to behave.
So the difference between substance abuse, substance dependence, addiction is kind of a moving target. Addiction is defined primarily by the consequences of people's use, and so to figure it out, you really have to look at how people use substances and the consequences of that use. Legal consequences, family relationship consequences, professional consequences.
Some people who struggle with addictions later in life had already started using in the early years.
It was when I was a student at the University of Tennessee, and I had to cut back the partying, the drinking, the pot use, all the other drug use, so I could keep enough grades to keep enough hours to keep my draft deferment. I couldn't do it. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't reel it back in enough to do what I needed to do to keep my draft deferment. Next thing I know, I'm being asked to join my fellow citizens in the U.S. Army.
Others begin to develop addictive habits during their military service.
Back in the mid-'70s, when I was in the military, that's where I learned to drink and use drugs, basically. There was a lot of that going on in the military. Now, I'm not saying everybody was doing it, but there was a lot of partying going on, a lot of drinking, a lot of drug use.
When I came into the military, when you walked into military barracks, you had one Coke product vending machine, one Pepsi product vending machine, and you might have 6 vending machines that distilled beer. So drinking as it was when I came into the military wasn't frowned upon. I mean, it was just something you did every day.
For many veterans who struggle with addiction, abusing substances, thrill-seeking, and other unhealthy behaviors have their roots in jarring operational experiences, both in war and behind the lines.
I got married, was back stateside for a while, had to go to Korea. And I was working with an aviation unit there, and there were some guys who were doing nap of the earth, should have been doing nap of the earth, and hit some damn telephone wires. And slammed that helicopter face first to a rice paddy and killed 5 out of 6 of them. And I mean, it tore them all to hell. We had to go in and recover the bird and recover them. And that, I think, that was the tipping point for me on a lot of my just daily drinking. And in Korea, I had the opportunity to do it. Vietnam didn't, but in Korea, I had the opportunity to do it. And man, I'd get off duty every damn day. It was like, I just hit it and hit it and hit it and hit it. And the trauma people I've worked with said, you didn't expect trauma there. You didn't expect death there.
The psychological aspects of PTSD have to do with a person who has gone through trauma. Either it happened to that person or they witnessed it happening to other people. Trauma is something in which a person's safety or life or health was threatened. One of the most important things about trauma is it renders the person who experiences it, even vicariously, it renders them helpless. People hate being helpless. And unfortunately, it works its way into the brain where it just kind of stays there and can show up with things like nightmares, flashbacks, where you re-experience quite vividly the traumatic event with all sorts of sensory aspects. You may hear things, see things, smell things, taste things that remind you of that. People startle easily. They develop a wariness.
My father went on to Vietnam, Korea, those three conflicts. He was a naval commander, and he told me some of what he went through as a combat commander in the Navy, and the sinking of ships and the loss of the men and the sharks taking hundreds of men. There were thousands of sharks in the water taking men, and there's nothing you can do about it. So you feel very powerless. The concept of watching that happen around you is just horrible. But again, he was able to talk about it and share. We pray for peace, but we have to train for war. And that's the unfortunate part of this. My mother was a British Army officer. She was one of the commanders for the women's anti-aircraft guns around London. And she had bullet holes in her legs and shrapnel wounds. She lost many, many women. The German fighters would come in and strafe the guns and try to wipe out the guns. And she lost many of her friends in that conflict. So when I look at that, I grew up not knowing about PTSD, but I witnessed it day in, day out, weeks, months, years. And my mother became an alcoholic.
They've been exposed to traumatic events in combat, or if they've witnessed them, or they have friends that have done that. Again, that can predispose to that. We don't know who gets PTSD. There's a lot of science research looking at genetics of it. There are twin studies ongoing by the VA. 5 guys can witness the exact same thing, and one gets post-traumatic stress disorder and 4 don't.
Veterans find their way into addictions by trying to manage pain. Physical pain, psychological pain, the pain of uncomfortable relationships, including the veteran's relationship to God.
What I suggest or what I offer or would recommend to my fellow veterans that got trauma or got addiction issues and such like that is to know that there are people who do understand. There are tons of veterans who are in recovery who have walked the same path as you're walking and have had the same feelings you feel, and you're not unique in this. I know myself, I just felt that no one could possibly understand. But there are, and it also and these folks have also, if you let them know what's going on, they can keep you safe from yourself. That was my biggest fear too. That if I ever got real, if I ever unlocked the bottle, ever opened up the box, let the genie out, it would consume me and all those around me. But know that you can be kept safe. You can be kept safe. For me, that was the most terrifying thing. It was just a total loss of control that I would never come back if I let this stuff out. I would be self-destructive or harm those around me. But there are programs and there are places, if you let them know, they can keep you safe and help you heal.
First of all, when a person becomes an alcoholic or an addict, they have chosen to obliviate their mind to whatever their issues are. That's free choice. So emotionally, I start to deteriorate very quickly. Then I give up my spiritual concepts, whatever they are. My human spirit starts to evaporate because alcohol and drugs removes that from me very quickly. I normally say something to the effect of, I'm through, heck with it, I'm moving past this, I'm going to go drink or drug. And the last part of that is the physical. The human body takes such abuse, but I see the people come in and they go, I'm sick of this, I'm sick of feeling the way I feel. And that becomes the point of, I want to do something about this.
One of the analogies that I frequently use is comparing it to physical therapy. A lot of times when we have an injury of some kind, especially a soft tissue type injury that requires a healing process to go on, part of that healing process is to break through the way that we've come to start to protect ourselves in a physical sense. And so physical therapy is not always a pleasant process, because the therapist has to go in and knead muscles, stretch ligaments, to do things that are uncomfortable for us in order to promote healing. Within dealing with psychological pain is no different. A lot of times we have to press into those spots that are sore or painful for the person in order for them to heal from them. When left to themselves, when walled off, those things that are painful, whether it be some sort of past trauma, whether it be pain in relationships, whether it be pain in terms of even how the person might feel about themselves, you know, the guilt maybe they carry that's related to their addiction, feelings of shame, resentments, anger, hurt, sadness, fear, all of those things that most of us have to deal with begin to get buried underneath the addiction.
Military deployments are a unique kind of stress for veterans and military families, even when the deployments are routine and uneventful.
I also think about my own deployment and what that was about. I never saw any combat, but simply being away for a long time is hard. It's really hard. You lose contact with folks, and so I sort of think about how that impacts the addiction relationship. In the addiction relationship, people get separated from each other, and when people get separated from each other, they lose understanding of what's going on. And I think that's probably what happens in the deployment process as well. The veteran's been gone for a year, 18 months, or 2 years, and can't possibly come back as the same person. The family's not going to be the same people. Things are going to be different, and so that's a huge adjustment. And being the substance-using culture that we are, it becomes very easy to start using substances to deal with the stress of trying to reconnect. It's real easy to, and that applies to both illicit and legal substances. It's real easy to get a doctor to write a prescription for an anti-anxiety agent because I'm having trouble with my anxiety or I'm having trouble sleeping. And the doctor says, now, you're just going to take this for a little while until you get adjusted. But the reality is that the medication can get in the way of that adjustment process. The medication becomes the adjustment process. So it becomes a pretty dangerous process to go after. Most of the veterans that we get are dealing with some form of PTSD, either from childhood experiences of growing up in a chemically dependent family, or as a direct result of their military experience as a result of combat or some other related kind of process. So it's very prevalent in the treatment program with the veterans.
What are some of the changes that people go through in the recovery process?
What are some of the changes people go through in the recovery process? The changes are absolutely incredible. One of the comments that gets made frequently in the treatment program to the patients is, don't leave till the miracle happens. And it's interesting to watch the patients respond to that. Their face gets kind of wrinkled up like, what the heck are you talking about? But the reality is, I was talking earlier about how the addict loses the ability to connect the dots between their using and the consequences of their using. And it's really fun when those dots begin to connect. and they have this really incredible aha kind of moment when they realize that they are the problem, that they are really the ones that have sort of set up this craziness as a result of this addiction. So that's always kind of fun to see, is to watch them go through that self-awareness. We do a lot of role-playing kinds of things with patients to have them practice talking to their spouse, their parent, their child. I may be rambling a bit here, but most parents will say that their children don't know what they're doing with respect to their addiction. We know that the kids always know what's going on, but the parents don't know that the kids don't know. So when they can begin to talk to the children and listen to what the children know, many of these aha experiences kind of come to light. And it's, on one hand, it's very hurtful, it's very painful, but on the other hand, it's very relieving that they don't have to keep the secret anymore. It's kind of out there on the table. I tell the patients it's a little bit like puking. It hurts like crazy, but after it's all over, it feels wonderful. So the process is really kind of fascinating, and it happens quickly for some, and some others it takes a long time.
Finally, the weight of shame can drive veterans down the road to addiction. Whether the shame is social, when the war is unpopular, personal, when connected to real or perceived failures, or spiritual, when a veteran feels unworthy of the love of God.
Coming home's tough. If I may, a brief history. In World War I, World War II, and the Korean conflict, we found that those men had weeks to come home. They had weeks to decompress. Vietnam came along, and now we're home in 24 hours. So there's no decompression time. We're sent back into civilian population with a war-like mind. So therefore it becomes more difficult. Now we've gone through Desert Storm, the Afghan conflict, and we're doing the same things over again. We're throwing our soldiers, men and women, back into the civilian population. And they're not ready because they haven't decompressed fully.
I think a lot of it had to do with the time that I was in the military. There were a lot of Vietnam veterans coming back that were being pretty much shunned by the public, called baby killers, and not really being very well respected coming home from the military. That in itself had an adverse effect on a lot of guys coming home or being discharged from the military.
So the veterans were treated very poorly, and they were pretty much thrown to the wolves, to be honest with you, which is the general public. And we were looked upon with some disdain. And I saw many men and women get off airplanes and go change clothes as fast as they could so they wouldn't be attacked verbally. And I couldn't blame them. It was a very sad situation. But to this day, I'm very proud of our country coming together and treating vets a lot better.
Addiction is a road that leads just one direction, down. There are exits, though, for those who are willing to get honest, get help, and get connected. The first step in recovery from any addiction is for the addict to recognize a problem he or she can't solve alone.
There was a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, a lot of anger at myself and others for the consequences of my drinking and using. Failed marriages, legal problems. I wanted to blame those around me for a lot of the things that happened to me. But I knew, I think deep down, that it was my fault. A lot of the things that occurred were my fault. They were consequences of my actions. And what I would say to those that are struggling with this is that just like their military commitment to do whatever it took to get the job done, if they would apply even just 50% of that to being as honest as they can about what's going on with them in their addiction, that they've got a chance to get out of that black hole of addiction.
The addict is rarely in denial that there's a problem. What they're in denial about is exactly what is the problem. And essentially they are the problem. And every aspect of their life is affected, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, physically. Every aspect of their life is affected.
There have been many challenges, but also many rewards in my recovery. The challenges today continue to be emotionally and just not be honest of word or cash register honest, but to be emotionally honest with those around me. That I still am challenged by that degree of honesty every day.
And once they get involved in community-based meetings, they start to see the group processing, and they get to learn the traditions of the meeting and the formulation of the meetings and how that group believes that a higher power or the God of someone's understanding are coming to believe in that, along spiritual principles such as honesty, integrity, willingness. Those are some of the spiritual principles they learn in community-based 12-step meetings and in conjunction with relationship with their sponsor.
And it just took those 3 words. I just said, God help me.
The next step in recovery is seeking the appropriate level of help to get the process started. For some, that might mean inpatient treatment, including detoxification and proper treatment on mental health issues. For others, a community-based 12-step or other program that includes both support and accountability may be the turning point they need. The company of other veterans may be valuable to service members as they start their journey of recovery.
And then I was working in a factory, a box factory, and was showing up late and missing work and staying out all hours of the night, drinking and using. And it became evident to my boss that I had a problem. So he sent me to treatment. It wasn't really my idea. In order to keep my job, I had to go to treatment. So I did.
One of the things I'd like to say, as a psychiatrist working with addiction, I know that about 40% of people with addiction have a coexisting psychiatric disorder.
Some of the psychological aspects I've seen and witnessed were a lot of depression. Number one was depression. And some of it was also not having the information of dealing with depression and those Axis 1 and 2 diagnoses. They weren't given that information. So we saw a lot of depression. We saw a lot of situational depression. We saw a lot of some of the ones that we saw that were hurt the most were diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, were diagnosed with, I can't remember the other names, but I saw a lot of the psychological responses. And they were not given medication appropriately because they didn't have the information. They didn't know what was going on wrong with them. So we've seen a lot of depression, we saw a lot of anxiety. A lot of it was major depressive diagnoses, such as anxiety disorders and displacement disorders because of transitioning from home, then going to service and coming back and not knowing how to deal with those stressors. So there was a lot of major stressors with those gentlemen in which we dealt with that. And that's the one we've seen the most.
At first, recovery from addiction can seem risky, like going outside the wire. In the long run, though, it opens new vistas, providing opportunities to heal old relationships, form positive new relationships, and provide support for others who are on the same path. Many recovering veterans rediscover and reaffirm their commitment to God in the course of their recovery.
You know, it's united we stand. There's more strength in a group than in an individual. And in just about every psychiatric problem, and definitely an addiction, you know, we tell people you can't do this by yourself. You need help. You need other people.
Addiction is a very alienating disease. It alienates the person from themselves. It alienates the person from those closest to them. And maybe most importantly, it alienates them from God. It alienates them from any sense of spiritual being, of meaning, of purpose, and really robs the person of their ability to be a human being.
The key to all of this, in my opinion, is building that great support system. In my experience over 25 years working in this field, and by the way, being an alcoholic, it's been my experience, the more people we can involve in this person's life on a positive way, the better the chances are that they can move through this addiction phase of their life and go on and become citizens who contribute a lot to society. Because believe it or not, most addicts and alcoholics are pretty sharp. They're pretty sharp people.
One that I see that works the most is a sense of understanding from people they're asking for help from. Community-based 12-step meetings, the Veterans Association, places in which I worked like Steps House Incorporated, places like Cornerstone of Recovery, Celebrate Recovery, where they're asking out and reaching for help and establishing that group of people they can go to with their issues and trust them with some of those issues. Even if it's just trusting one person, they're getting in touch with people who have their best interest at heart and are not trying to hurt them, because a lot of these guys have been in the service for years, have been in the VA system forever, and they're treated, from my experience and what has been told to me, as a number when they go get services. So now they're in a sense of community. And the change is you start to see them have relationships with their family. They start to address legal issues. They start to address financial issues. They start to try to live responsibly. When you see a young man come in who has been living under the bridge, and 2 years later after working with him, you see him having relationships with his family, has the license back, has a job, full-time employment, and has his own apartment, communication with his children, ex-wife, and family members, and is living his life without the use of alcohol and drugs. It's a beautiful process to watch.
When I started going to the meetings, I realized, man, I'm just exactly like every one of these guys. And then, because of my history and religious background, I felt like I wasn't worthy to have a better life. I felt guilty about not living the way I should. My spiritual or religious beliefs prior to my addiction, I felt like I was not going to be able to have a relationship with God as I understood Him. But I found out that for me, there's a difference between spirituality and religion. And I have seen over and over again, not just for me, but for people who go through treatment, that if they are unable to make that spiritual connection, a power greater than themselves in some form or fashion, that the relapse rate for those people is very high. You see a lot of people come in, and myself included, just spiritually dead. Almost like a feeling of loss of soul or self because of their actions prior to getting into treatment. And to see people reconnect or connect with that spiritual aspect of recovery is like watching them be born again, really.
I felt an internal struggle with something. That there was something I needed to do. There was something out there God wanted me to do. And we buried Bernard, and it was about a month or so later, my niece called me up, and her husband at the time was studying to be a minister, and they're involved with this program, or not program, but this spiritual type group called the Emmaus Walk, and it's a spiritual retreat over the weekend. And they just called me up and said, "Hey, you're going." So I went on this spiritual retreat, and I've always been told that I needed God in my life to remain clean and sober. But when I come out of that retreat, I realized that not only did I need God in life, God in my life to remain clean and sober, but I wanted Him in my life. And it was at that point in time I also reconnected with my own religious upbringing and realized that through Jesus Christ is the only way that I'm really going to be connected to God.
Recovery from addictions has its challenges. Some struggle to keep their recovery on course. Still, the rewards that come from better physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health are much higher than the discomforts that may go along with breaking the chains of addiction.
And you have to risk that somebody knows more than you do, that somebody's going to lead you down the right path, and that somebody's going to show you some positive examples of how you can turn that around, and that that risk can be very rewarding and worthwhile.
But the challenge is for that fundamental honesty and to not to wall off again and allow those sicknesses to take me and cause me problems today.
And by self-care, I mean things like paying attention to doing those things that are nurturing for you. That could be exercising. It might be yoga. It might be some form of meditation. It could be a hobby. It could be spending time with your family. It could be going camping. There are any number of things that people find relaxing, and they vary from person to person. But we all need to do things that nurture who we really are, that nurture us at a soul level. And to become connected with a faith community, to become connected with a spiritual community, can be of a huge help to people. To begin to help make that transition from a military mindset also to a civilian mindset. In a war zone, obviously, a person has to have a different type of mindset just to survive that situation than they do in day-to-day existence. And so that's one of the things that creates a lot of difficulty for both veterans and for their families sometimes, is making that transition. Because it doesn't happen in a day, it doesn't happen in a week, it doesn't even happen in a month most times. It's a process that takes time to develop, and you have to be patient with that.
But the benefit of speaking about it isn't because somebody else is going to find it out. It's because it's going to let it out of my head. It's going to help me take some of the power away from it. Things are much less powerful when they're kind of put on the table in front of me rather than left banging around inside my head.
Probably the biggest hurdle for me was learning how to be in a healthy relationship. I didn't know how to do that.
In AA, they say that there's only one thing that a person has to change, and that one thing is everything. And that's the hardest thing for most of us as human beings, is changing, because we become content with the familiar. And then we have difficulty taking those steps that are going to pull us into a better place. For example, changing the people, changing the places, changing the things that we've come to love that are attached to our addiction.
And that relapse is one of the things that hurt our veterans the most, because when they do, they go back to that dereliction and isolation. So when we can see and implement an intervention through community-based 12-step meetings, through sponsorship, through being accountable to the groups when they go to meetings, I think that is the beauty of stopping that relapse. When a person starts to recover, from my experience and personal experience and watching others, when a person relapses and returns to that former state, and they can look and see how their lives had changed early in the early stages of recovery, and they come back to that, they can use that experience from going back to a former state of being and making a cognitive decision to say, I don't want this type of lifestyle anymore, and return to recovery. And some of the recovery literature tells us that a relapse can be a growing point. So is relapse a part of recovery? Some people say it is, and some people say it doesn't. It isn't, excuse me. But I believe it depends on the person. But for those who relapse and realize that, hey, I don't want this type of lifestyle, and they come back to recovery and they apply it to their lives, it can be a benefit.
What can you do to help a fellow veteran who is dealing with addiction and recovery? First, remember that you can't do it alone, any more than the person who's addicted can. Be part of a supportive group like Vet Connect that you can bring a struggling veteran into. If the addict is a partner, close relative, or even a close friend, you might find a group for family members like Al-Anon helpful for keeping your own equilibrium. Second, be patient. Addiction has many layers and they take time to work through. In Jesus' story of the prodigal son, it took the prodigal years to find his way back home. But the father never quit waiting for him to come to himself again. Third, trust God to do what you can't. Pray without ceasing, but don't get drawn into someone else's problems so that it becomes your own. And if someone's recovery stalls, do what you can to help them get back on track. But be patient and forgiving of yourself and trust them to the mercies of the higher power above all others. Thank you for being part of this session, and thank you for your service.